Today I'm here with Stella O'Malley, an Irish therapist who has just recently founded a new organization called Genspect, which is all about parents of children who have gender issues and gender questioning and troubles. So, Stella, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to talk to you because I've been wanting to talk to you for a while now, actually.
Funny, because I was the same. It's like there's a few people, I suppose, in this world, we kind of get to know each other. We
Mhm.
don't get around to talk to each other, but when we get the chance, like, yes, I definitely would like to speak to Sasha White. Yes.
Yeah,
Do you know what
exactly.
I
I
mean?
feel the
Yeah.
same way. And I've been listening to your and Sasha Ayad's podcast, which is so wonderful and informative and harrowing at times.
Yeah.
So today we're going to talk about Genspect. And could you start us off by just telling us about Genspect and why you founded it and a little bit about your background for people who don't know?
Okay, well, I'll do the long version, if you don't mind. You can cut
Please.
in if I get too boring.
Hmm.
So, like when I was a kid, I did have gender issues, and they were very strange and very intense. But I grew out of them in puberty. Took a long time to grow out of them in puberty. It wasn't quick, but I did, and I ultimately became very comfortable in my own body and perfectly happy, and ended up, becoming a mother, and certainly very pleased that I'm a woman, having been so sure when I was a kid that not only should I be a boy, but I'd be better as a boy. And I can still see that in me. I can see why. I see my personality would have been a good boy as such. And then I went on and had my life. And when I was in my early 30s, I became a psychotherapist. And I loved it and started writing. And I wrote a few books, mental health books on mental health and parenting. And I used to write, well, I still write for the national newspapers quite often in Ireland. And I noticed as life went on, I did notice in the 90s that LGB became LGBTQ and LGBT. And I did notice that in the 90s. And I remember thinking, that seems very unusual because they're two different things. Sexual orientation isn't the same as trans issues. And I remember noticing that, but that's fine. I was, I did notice it seemed incongruent, but that's all I noticed. Then when we get on and I, wrote my books, first book was released in 2015, Cotton Wool Kids. And then somewhere along the way, I used to say to my husband, you know what, I should say things about trans because there's an issue that isn't being explored, which is there's people like me who are children who had big gender issues and didn't really and resolved them and didn't transition, and they're perfectly happy. Where are those voices? Long story short, I ended up writing an article just thinking, well, I had a very intense episode, lasted 7 years, from around about 3 until I was around about 10, and then between 10 and a few years onto that was the pulling away. So we're talking a long and extended version. When you look at the DSM and you look at the criteria now, they only ask for you to have gender issues for 6 months. I had them for over 7 years. So it's phenomenal, like, if you think of it. And I was very intense in it. Anyway, I wrote the article and I was asked to do a film on trans issues, and it's called Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk, and it was released in 2018. From then on, I was quite immersed in gender issues. Huge amount of people contacted me after the film. Some people were trans people who contacted me because they were unhappy with their transition. Some people were happy enough with their transition, but realized they could have lived a life without transitioning. So those very thoughtful things came in. An awful lot of parents contacted me saying, I'm desperately distraught and I'm afraid my child is going to transition and they won't suit it for various reasons. And I started seeing different people in different contexts around trans issues, but I was a bit shocked at how varied and how high the numbers were of people contacting me. And so life went on. I became involved in detransitioners, and I was starting to help and work with detransitioners quite a lot. And then I was asked, it was very much a COVID story. About March 2020, I was asked by some parents, would you consider running some online support meetings for parents who are unhappy with the way their children are being treated by doctors and therapists? And I said, sure, I would. I'd be delighted. And they'd already contacted me in many numbers anyway. So I knew they were a cohort that were being ignored and dismissed. And so I started the online meetings I started them in April 2020. And I knew there was other parent support groups, and they're brilliant. you know. So our group is the Gender Dysphoria Support Network, which is the GDSN. But there's some other brilliant support groups like Parents of RGD Kids. It's huge in America. And it's all over. It's in Australia. Bayswater is huge in the UK. Our Duty is in America and in England and in the US. And there's lots of other parents groups as well, like in all sorts of countries, like Switzerland and Sweden and stuff. And what I didn't realize until I started the parent support groups, how similar the stories were. How many kids, these were really varied parents from all sorts of backgrounds, but they were all saying the same story. My nerdy, awkward, socially awkward, distressed, traumatized child with a range of comorbidities like ADHD, ASD, OCD, anxiety, has spent a lot of time online and suddenly and radically declared that they were trans. And it's come from nowhere. It came in like a rocket. And it's very disorientating for the parents because they think this is a long line of diagnosis and this is a self-diagnosis from the internet. And suddenly all eyes are on gender and it's all about gender when they go to the therapist. When it used to be OCD and their ASD and their various different, you know. So anyway, when we started in April 2020, it was unbelievable how quickly it kind of escalated. So we started with 1 meeting a week, then 2 meetings a week, then 3 meetings, 4 meetings a week, then meetings for parents whose children had medicalized, not just parents who were, you know, fearful of their children medicalizing. And these were parents who found it really difficult to navigate a new life with their child. Imagine you give birth to a little girl and you call her a name. And I remember one parent saying, the first word I said to my baby was her name. It was the first word I said. And then they drop the name, they get testosterone, they change, their voice changes, their name changes, their identity changes, they wipe out their past identity, and the parents are left flailing, going, did we provide a happy childhood? What was it, the childhood that they were there for 20 years? Or was it all a sham? Or what happened? So these are really distressed parents who are very engaged, very loving, and the numbers were high and very quickly very high. We ran meetings for just dads. We ran meetings for siblings. We still do. We're still running all these meetings. But I quite quickly realized, wow, we need something much bigger. There's all these parent support groups. They're all over the world. They're all saying the same thing. And they're not being heard because they're hamstrung because they need to be anonymous, because these are traumatized families right in the middle of a huge, generally the biggest trauma of their life. And that's why we founded Genspect. Big long intro into that. But that's why we founded Genspect, because I thought we need to give some voice to these parents. And what we need to do is have a kind of umbrella organization that basically lifts parents' voices into the media so that people realize there's a whole side story. And I know it's very distressing to have gender dysphoria. I know it's really, really difficult to have issues with your gender. I get it. However, there's a whole other story of it's very distressing to be a parent and to have your child rushed down a medical pathway when you think it's the wrong thing. And to have a culture where everybody's saying it's the right thing, it's the right thing. And you're like Cassandra saying, I don't think it is. I actually know my child better than anybody else. And I care about my child better than anybody else. But everybody's dismissing me and calling me a transphobic bigot, when honestly, I have never had a transphobic bone in my body. This is genuinely specific to my child. I honestly think they won't suit it because of their autism, because of their OCD. I think this heavy burden that the medical transition places on their body will be too much for my child. And so we founded Genspect just about 2 weeks ago or something. And it's been really big, very, very quickly. We got a very big response of all the parents groups saying, thank God, people are starting to listen to us, because they were hamstrung. They were feeling they had to be anonymous and secret. And then suddenly nobody was hearing their side of the story. It was a particularly horribly frustrating situation to be in. Mm-hmm. And that's why we founded it.
Yeah. It's something where I used to kind of wonder about the parents who would allow their kids to transition or encourage their kids to transition, because it's really hard to wrap your brain around the fact that a parent would want their child to receive these experimental medications and things like that. After reading Schreier's book, I remember I got more of a picture, but it wasn't until I actually attended one of these meetings. I happened to attend an ROGD parent meeting because
Did you?
Yeah, MK Fain and I do a podcast. She's a
I know.
feminist programmer. She
Yeah.
started 4W Pub in Spinster. And her and I were invited to one of these meetings because we kind of give advice to young people about gender critical issues, or we try to.
Yeah.
And we got this email from this parent group, this NYC Parents of
Yeah.
ROGD, and I told them several times, like, we're not experts, and we haven't
Yeah.
been through this
But they're
ourselves.
desperate. They will talk to
Yeah,
anybody. And I'm not saying they're desperate for you,
yeah,
but
but that's what
they
it
will
was.
literally, what they're saying is anybody who knows
Mm-hmm.
anything about gender, please, and they really put the effort in, please talk to us. We're trying to seek a better understanding of our children. So they
Yeah,
invited you, go on. And so you were
yeah,
at one of those meetings. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, it was so heart-wrenching to see the parents, to hear them, to see the look in their eyes as they talked about their children. And it was truly gut-wrenching. That's when it really became real to me, so much more than just reading about the stories or hearing about them, because you see the pain and the way it's torn these families apart, torn some of the couples apart, the parents,
Yeah.
and they're just struggling to pick up the pieces with, like you said, the sort of shaming that they get from their social group. So that's what I wanted to bring it to, was
Mm.
how the parents can be kind of susceptible to this public pressure in addition to the kids.
Very much so. And the parents feel lonely and isolated. Sometimes the extended family doesn't understand. Sometimes the friends don't understand. And then, as one parent says, yeah, until it happens to them. And then
Mm-hmm.
it does happen to them because there is social contagion. And so, very often, the friends do transition. And then those parents come onto their side, which is really distressing and traumatizing. And it's what's happening. But the loneliness of these parents, the lonely heartache they go through because they feel their child is being misunderstood and mistreated, and everybody else is saying no, it's great. And it's a horribly, I remember one parent saying, it's like I was at the doctor's office and my child had so many diagnoses. This mother was saying that she had a range of diagnoses, and the child had real severe distress in many ways, and she took him, the child, to the doctor, very much thinking, yeah, like, honestly, the doctor's going to see that there's so many diagnoses going on here, that gender is just one of many issues. And no, that didn't happen immediately. Oh, gender. Oh, well, we have to medically transition you. And this child wasn't, mature or capable to understand what would be the long-term impact of this. And I remember she said it was like the doctor in a film rips off his mask and he's the monster coming to get my kid. And I was like, oh my God. And that's, I think, what happens with these parents is they go to the gender clinics, they say, right, okay, you're trans, okay, I get it. And there's an arc, it's a very noticeable arc. And generally the first part of the arc is you've loads of diagnoses, you're autistic, you're OCD, but I will bring you to the gender clinics because the gender clinics know their stuff. And so I'll bring you there, and then you'll get the right treatment, and we'll deal with this, just like we've dealt with all your other issues. And by the way, just in the GDSN meetings, about 90% of the parents that I see, the children have diagnoses. So it's much higher than what's being seen in the hospitals. And I would say they're the distressed parents. They're saying, yeah, my kid definitely has other issues.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they're seeking more support. And they take the child to the gender clinics, and within one meeting, within 2 meetings, within 3 meetings, the child is being prescribed either puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones, depending on the age and depending on the region where they are located. And the parent is absolutely astonished because didn't expect that, because they thought, oh no, I thought there would be psychological support, which clearly was needed because my kid has never had a gender non-conforming bone in their body until a month ago. And they went online and discovered things. So that's the driving kind of impulse that brings the parents in, and the loneliness brings the parents in. And it's one thing I'd really like to kind of, anybody who's listening, if you do know parents, be aware that this is a very lonely road. If your child has any other mental health condition like gender dysphoria but different, maybe anorexia or any other issue, you get a cultural sympathy and you get a cultural support. With this, you don't. You get told, fast track them now, it's the best thing. And it's like, well, honestly, this is what a 10-year experiment we're into. Nobody's been fast-tracked except in the last 10 years. We don't know. We don't know how this will work out. We do know the only long-running study in the world of trans issues, which is the Detransition study from Sweden in 2011, that actually was around about 10 years, that the people who are trans, they fall from a cliff with mental well-being about that point, because it's very, very difficult to live as a transition person. Not necessarily because of bigotry or lack of acceptance, but because you're in hospital all the time, you've got complications all the time, you're continuously attending to kind of physical issues, you're on kind of appointments all the time, and you're continuously fighting your body against something. And so it's physically very, very demanding, and it's also psychically very demanding. And there's a whole kind of huge issue about whether should you change your body or should you change your mind, which is conversion therapy, which is, because changing your body or changing your mind, which is conversion therapy. And so there's so many issues about this. It's a new phenomenon. There was never before large numbers of adolescents suddenly having gender issues. Never happened before. We've no research on this. So whatever research people point to, even the research I just declared there a minute ago, none of it will be for adolescents, because there is no long-term adolescent research, because it didn't happen, never happened before. So we're in the middle of an experiment. The parents are devastated. And by the way, some of the parents, I know I'm ranting, but some of the parents come in and they almost stumble in and they say, yeah, I know I have to be very happy about my child transitioning. And I know my words, and I've been to all the affirmative meetings, and there would be at meetings, different meetings than ours. And they hear the other parents who say, well, I'm not happy. And they go, well, now I can speak the truth. I'm up every morning at 3 a.m. crying in my toilet, lying on the ground, bawling my eyes out, thinking this is all wrong. So some of the parents who are saying they're very happy are living a very secret life of fear and distress, but they think it's the right thing to do, to affirm their kid. And so they've locked themselves into that pathway. Bring them into our meetings and suddenly they go, oh my God, I can finally say my truth. And, it really spills out of them.
Yeah. One of the complaints that people make about anything gender critical, they kind of lobby this accusation that for parents to not affirm their kids' trans identity is like conversion therapy, as you said, or it's just some kind of like homophobic, transphobic abuse. And that's what people label it. Like, I was just listening to this debate between Glenn Greenwald and Nathan J. Robinson, who's another journalist, and they were talking about Jesse Singal's coverage of detransitioners. I don't know if you remember that article. It was from a few years ago. Yeah. And Jesse wrote about detransitioners. He got a lot of flack for it. Arguably, he got somewhat canceled. And I think he stands by what he wrote. I don't think any of it was, debunked or untruthful. But brilliant. People reacted to it because they considered it transphobic. And what Nathan J. Robinson was saying in this debate was that, and he claimed to have read Schreier's book, which I was surprised that you could read that book and still have such a callous view towards, what you're putting forward. But he said that his issue with that book was that it only focused on the parents, and that Schreier only talked to the parents and didn't talk to the kids and didn't ask the kids their perspective. So in his mind, this is like giving the platform to the abusive, regressive parents, when the kids should be the ones that we somehow as the saviors step in to help.
Yeah, it feels very aggressive, that idea that all these parents are all these kind of bigoted, old-fashioned 1950s kind of authoritarians. And when you meet them, you meet liberal, educated, progressive, loving, engaged parents who've been sending their child to different therapists, play therapy and everything. They have really been on it from the beginning. And it's only when you meet them, like you say, I would have my doubts I think you were implying whether he'd read it, because could you really read Abigail Schreier's book and be so callous to the parents? It feels incongruous and a little bit unlikely. Maybe he did, but I know I've met the parents. I've met so many of the parents, and these parents again and again and again say, if I thought transition was the right path, I would help him. I would help her in every way possible. But I don't. I don't think it's the right path for my kid. And then the next parent says the same thing and the same thing. And what's extraordinary, there was a few things you brought up there, but one thing that's extraordinary is how similar the personalities of these kids are. And that seems weird. Like we're going from Sydney to Sweden to America, and they all have the same personality types. They're all shy, nerdy kids, socially awkward, who are clever. And then there's a cohort, there's slightly different cohort. So that's one, that's the really dominant child, parent of the child that's in these, Genspect and GDSN and stuff. But then there's a cohort of parents who say, I think my child's a lesbian, and I think she will not admit it. And I think this is internalized lesbophobia. And I think it's really strong in her. And these parents try to say to the children again and again, might it be that you're gay? And they get shot down. And one thing that's really noticeable about this generation, this specific cohort of kids, is they seem to have submerged their sexual identity into a gender identity. And it feels very repressive. It frankly feels actually Freudian, that they are suppressing and repressing their sexual identity. The sexual identity of these kids, very often, not always, there's a cohort that make out that they're very sexually free. I wonder, they're certainly not very intimate, and they're certainly not very vulnerable in their sexuality. There's a huge cohort that are just absolutely clamping down on their sexual identity. It's all about gender. They claim that they're pansexual. They claim that they're bisexual. I heard somebody say, it was an Angus Fox, somebody said that being bisexual these days is just being polite. they don't want to kind of say no to anybody. It feels the right thing to be. And I kind of think an awful lot of them, especially any of the kids I've seen, I'm just like, there's nothing sexual going on for them. And I'm thinking it has been repressed. It has been repressed. And until they start enjoying their sexual development, we won't know whether this is internalized homophobia, because they actually are so out of touch with their sexuality. Now, there might be some kind of masturbation, there might be some autogynephilia with some of the boys and things like that. So I am aware of there is different kind of minorities within the minority, but there's a whole cohort of girls who are declaring a trans identity, who have very definitely repressed their sexual identity. And I think it's safe. It's a scary world these days. And they're frightened of life. They're frightened of growing up. And they're focusing on their gender as a coping mechanism. And it's very much the Lisa Littman study of the ROGD kid. They're the parents I see. But to go back to the detransition and the homophobia and all this sort of stuff, come into our meetings, go and meet, in Genspect, we've got a great section, which is the testimonials, parents' testimonials from everywhere, from all over the world. And just read through them and tell me that they're homophobic bigots who were back in the 1950s, because you couldn't. And the same with Abigail Schreier's book, you know what I mean? You couldn't. You can't read this and pretend that lie to yourself, because it's actually just not true.
Yeah. And do you think that the majority of those girls, I mean, when they are repressing their sexuality in that way, does part of it, are they aware that the treatments will block their sexuality, and is that a draw for them?
Well, I don't think, in my experience, these kids really haven't gone very far, and that's why the parents are so worried. They really haven't gone very far, and it's like right now, I need to be declared, and it's all about my pronouns and my names today. And yes, I want the medication. It will impact your sexual function. I don't care, because I hate my body. I hate my genitals. So the hell do I care? I don't care about infertility or fertility. I don't care about sexual functioning. I don't care about orgasm. I'm nowhere near orgasm. I absolutely hate my body. So they're so closed down on it. And I remember being a teenager, and I remember being so extraordinarily kind of, poof, we will not think about that. Bang. I just live on this way and this, that intense, because why? The teenage brain is a brain under construction. And they literally, if you look at neuroscience, you'll see that the rewards section of the brain is more developed than the consequences when you're a teenager. This isn't new. This is a fact. So they're just thinking reward equals transition, name, pronouns, all the consequences. Don't be giving me the consequences. I don't care about the consequences. Give me the reward and give it to me quick. And they honestly think, because there's nothing more alluring in life, and it's such an extraordinary concept of take this pill and you could be somebody different, a new name, new identity, a new person with a new life, with a new personality, with an erased past. So all that shame and embarrassment and humiliation of not being, the cool kid or not being wanted or being bullied, that's all wiped. Because now you're a new person with a new identity. That's the most alluring concept I've ever come across. I really have. I've never come across anything more alluring. And they understandably, they're 13, they go, yeah, I'll take that. I'm unhappy. I hate my body. Everybody hates me. I hate me. I don't like me. I'm embarrassed about who I was and I'm embarrassed about who I am. I don't want to be me. I'll be somebody else. Yeah, let's go. Quick. Mm-hmm. I can see why they go for it. But the concept is a mirage.
Yeah.
Because the reality is you are still, there's a great book by John Kabat-Zinn. He's a kind of grandfather of mindfulness. And, he wrote a book called Wherever You Go, There You Are. And it's like, you can take everything, you can transition every single part of your body and you're still you. When you wake up in the morning, all your thoughts, all your distress, all your, is still there. You can't be anybody else. You're always you. And that's a hard, existential, deep and profound lesson that 13-year-olds aren't quite able to understand or comprehend even.
Right. So the question is, why is this being sold to them? I mean, you've done a lot of thinking about this, I'm sure, is why are doctors pushing this? Why are the experts going along with this?
It's the $1 million question. It's the $1 million question. And yet I'm a psychotherapist and I love working as a psychotherapist, but I don't think my industry is great. I don't think psychology has covered itself in glory over the decades. I think there's been an awful lot of medical scandals. I think if you look at the multiple personality disorder kind of scandal, it went from being 1 in 5 million to 1 in 20 or something extraordinary, like the numbers. When a condition comes in, it can come in hard and fast. And what you need is gullible cohort of people, which you could argue is the teenagers, the shy, nerdy teenagers especially, or the lesbophobic, homophobic kid. And also you need enthusiastic doctors, keen, enthusiastic doctors. That drives these scandals. There's been many of them. Sasha White did a great kind of analysis of the lobotomy scandal way back. And there's been so many other ones that, extraordinarily weird satanic daycare panic, which I do notice that Diane Aronsoft, who's a big, huge advocate of child transition, she wrote a paper in favor of the satanic daycare panic.
What was that? Just for people who don't know.
I'd be able to send it to you after, but she wrote a paper, saying the awful Satan kind of going on, shenanigans that were going on in the daycare, because she was an advocate of that this was happening, as opposed to, let's question this further. Do you follow me?
And what was the satanic daycare panic?
Oh, what was it? Sorry. It was in the 80s and 90s. It was a phenomenally sad and harrowing story that was based in the USA of all these daycare, we're talking 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds. The nursery managers were accused of satanic child abuse rituals. And they didn't do it, but they were accused of it. And kind of keen and over-enthusiastic, zealous psychiatrists and psychologists decided that the children were being abused in this satanic kind of daycare ritual, crazy.
Wow. So they imagined there was some conspiracy around all these different daycares?
Yeah. Huh. Yeah. And people got like 20 years in prison. These nursery managers, it was awful. People's lives were destroyed. in the 80s and the 90s. I'll just send you information. People's lives were absolutely ripped apart by this. It sounds so insane. It's like, you can't be telling me that happened. It happened. And it was really, really, really harsh. And people's lives, marriages were destroyed, families were destroyed. Very like another scandal that happened among psychiatrists. Like I say, we are not a great industry for this, and well, I'll go back to that in a sec. But another one would be the repressed memory syndrome, where an awful lot of people suddenly declared that they remembered, they might be 35 years old, they mightn't have had a happy life, and they suddenly remembered out of nowhere that they were experienced child abuse as a child. When you start to learn about child abuse, and you'd realize that people who abuse children abuse again and again. And the likelihood of a father, for example, abusing a child and then going on and never doing it ever again to anybody else is quite unlikely. But anyway, that was yet another kind of scandal. They're all enmeshed together, but the 1990s was a particularly difficult period for all of that. And you look at it and you think enthusiastic, zealous psychologists and psychiatrists who are very keen to be the genius who spots these extraordinary cases. And when you're at the beginning, at the cusp of a new phenomenon, a new condition, it's very easy to make your name. It's very, because there's nobody else writing about it. And so they get their name in the history books. And I frankly, the power goes to their head and they think they can spot. And that's what, when you look at the kind of the gender dysphoria issue, and you realize it was all based on basically 2 studies of the same 70 children in Amsterdam. And the entire concept of puberty blockers for gender dysphoric children is based on those studies, 2011 and 2014. 2 studies of the same 70 kids. One of the kids died when they were actually having genital transition surgery, if you follow me, cross-sex surgery, I suppose it's called.
Wow. What year was that the child died?
Well, they had died by 2014 because the 2 studies were 2011.
So this was extremely recent. This isn't like, in the 1950s before they knew how to do the surgery.
No. When you start studying it and you go, hang on a second, the entire premise of puberty blockers is based on these 2 Dutch studies. And in these 2 Dutch studies, not only did 1 out of 70 die in their cross-sex transition, in the surgery, because of complications because of the surgery. Not only that, but there was quite a high dropout. So about 15 or 16 dropped out of the study. That's not a great study. That's not to run the entire premise of puberty blockers on the basis of a study that 15 or 16 kids dropped out of and 1 died. You're like, no, that's not gold standard stuff. And yet, why did they do it? Remember, you went back to the question, why are the doctors doing it? I think hubris. I think arrogance. I think a feeling that they can make their name. I think it's extraordinarily, do you remember I said the alluringness of you can be, I think it's very alluring, sadly, for psychiatrists and psychologists to be pioneers. To be pioneers of the mind, and to think, we understand it and nobody else does, and we will lead the way and we will tell you all. And I do know, and I know I shouldn't probably diss my own industry, but I've got to if I'm going to be ethical. I do know that there's a kind of a feeling in conferences that there can often be a slightly on high, we understand the brain and nobody else does. It can feel quite icky sometimes, that there's a real vibe. If you get a group of, psychologists or psychotherapists together, it can feel quite like we get it, the rest of the world doesn't. Now put that into a new condition and you're really in a very kind of heady kind of place. And I think that's how it happened.
Okay. Yeah. Something that I can't help but think of is how there's sort of a genre of young adult novels where this is the villainous plot. It's actually to destroy the sexual function of children. I mean, I can think of 2, which are The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman and The Giver. And I don't know if you're familiar with either of these books, but in The Giver, it's a dystopia where when you reach puberty, they start giving you these pills and they actually block your libido so that people don't have a libido at all in this society. grow up and are assigned with a partner, and then everything is very, very sterile. And so they don't want people to have those out of control feelings because that would cause chaos and disorder. And then the other book is The Golden Compass. And the plot is about these kids escaping this because it's obviously evil and dystopian. And then the other book is The Golden Compass, which is just uncannily similar to what's really happening, which is that the villain of the story has this plot in this laboratory where she's kidnapping children and bringing them, and it's sci-fi fantasy, so she's performing a cut on them, and the cut is meant to stop them from ever developing original sin, like how when you reach puberty you then inherit that original sin of like lust and those types of things. And this cut is supposed to prevent that and make you this like sterile, non-passionate person. And once again, the villain is the person doing that and the doctors, and the hero is the girl who goes to save the children. So, and then of course the fact that Philip Pullman himself has not condemned this gender industry is funny, a little bizarre, but
just like Margaret Atwood.
Yeah, Margaret Atwood is another one who it's like, how do you not see the messages from your own fiction?
But isn't there a great quote with, it's amazing what people, well, I'm going to mangle this quote, but it's amazing what people won't see when their career depends on it.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, like similar to the doctors who are just overzealous, they don't want to see. And then we have this with journalists as well, where they won't cover it because they know there will be blowback in their careers.
And can I just say on that point, this blowback in their careers, one, it's overstated. Insofar as, no, I'm saying it to the wrong person by saying that to you, but I know you're a particularly frightening example of how it can go wrong. But for many people, if they come out, they can manage. Philip Pullman could come out quite easily. Margaret Atwood could come out. And they don't need to tell me that this would ruin their lives. It wouldn't ruin their life, if you follow me. It would be very complicated and it would be tiresome. You know what I mean? Now, you were obviously very young and vulnerable, you know what I mean? Because of your youth. It's a very different context. People like you, I totally get it. And parents, I totally get it. And certain contexts, I totally get it, totally. But I do think that the blowback in the careers is creating a conspiracy of silence where it would be much more effective if everybody came out, you know what I mean? And everybody came out. It feels very Stasi like that all these people can contact me. And I'm talking to some really, really, really successful people and famous people and say, I can't come out because of my career. And it's like, what are we living in? Talk about McCarthyism and Mao, China, you know, Mao's China. It's so extraordinary about that. But anyway, sorry, I didn't know about those books. That's fascinating.
It's fascinating to me because it's so similar. And another thing about the Golden Compass is that this cut that they perform, it's there in this fantasy world. You have a demon, an animal that is like your soul outside of your body that's always with you. You can't be separated. And they cut that away from you. And the demon is almost always the opposite sex from you. So there's something gendered about it. There's something very much about your gender, your sexuality, all of that, whether you're male, female, feminine, masculine. So it's, that's something that I'm waiting for someone to write about, because I'm sure that will be written about that book.
Can I ask, do trans, identified teenagers, do they like those books? Are they popular or are they?
That's a great question. I mean, they're not new. They were from, I think, maybe the 90s, those books. Is this trilogy. Wow. I used to love them as a kid. I'm not sure how widely read they are now. I would be curious, actually, to know. I wonder if they'll start burning them next, like they burn Harry Potter. I was wondering, have you faced any blowback in your career?
I have, yes, quite a lot. So the film that I did called Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk, the premise of the film was, could there be, of the 4,000% increase of children presenting with gender issues in the last 10 years, and that is the numbers, could any of these kids be like me? Could any of these kids grow out of it?
And is
Could it
that
just be,
4,000 in a particular country?
well, in England, yeah, in
Okay.
the UK, yeah.
Mm.
4,000% increase among girls, 3,000, I think, percent increase among girls and boys. But and it's, you know, fairly equal in Ireland. It's very similar in Ireland to England. But yeah, the premise of the film was, could any of these kids be like me? Could they grow out of it if they were just left to it? And could it be a coping mechanism for an unhappy childhood? Because I was a very unhappy kid. And I think it was for me. It was also some sort of grab for power. But I say that in hindsight. It was so long ago, I feel a bit uneasy. But I feel that's what it was, but who knows? I thought the power lay with the boys. Ain't no doubt about that. And I thought I was internalized misogynist. I thought girls were awful. I hated them, you know. So I do think there's a lot. I work with a lot of detransitioners, and they often talk about just hating girls and hating anything to do with girls, you know. But yeah, I did receive a lot of blowback. I feel, you know, I read that great book by Quillette, was it Panic and Persecution in the Digital Age, about people being cancelled. Although when you say we're cancelled, an awful lot of people, I think we're like zombies, the undead. We keep going and end up with very successful careers. So to say we're cancelled isn't quite appropriate. We just get extraordinary harrowing events happen to us of, you see people that should be your friends and should be your colleagues and should be your comrades in distress, and they don't stand by you. And it's a devastating feeling of, in that book, that Quillette book about the kind of cancellations, they just said, like, basically the phone stops ringing, everybody just silently shrinks away. Do you follow me? So I write for the media in Ireland, and I've written a few books and stuff like that, and it was quite tangible how everybody went quiet on me, but they knew me for mental health, and they knew me very well for mental health. So, you know, thankfully a few people still did. But it was very distressing. And, you know, there were a couple of complaints sent in to my license, and it was ridiculous, you know, my license to work. It was ridiculous because it was all like, you know, it was all really crazy stuff. The complaints, they had nothing on me, because genuinely, you can big brother me and get a laser into my brain and you will not find transphobia, you know what I mean? So they had nothing on me. So the complaints were fairly garbled, I felt, and fairly absolutely unsubstantiated and unsubstantiable, if you follow me. They couldn't. But it was very, very, very difficult and very, very stressful. I think now that I've been out so long saying the same thing, I think everybody knows my position at this stage. Well, maybe they don't. I don't know, but I'm like a zombie. I keep going.
Mm-hmm. And then you suddenly become this center of gravity for all these parents. And I know you're like inundated with clients and waiting lists and everything like that.
Yeah, it's the most distressing part of my life, hands down by a million miles, is all the emails I get. I get so many emails of parents saying, I'm so distressed, of people who are in distress because of their trans. I'm also part of the IATDD.com, and that's a International Association for Detransitioners and Desisters, and it's they're seeking kind of help. So there's an awful lot of people who are really, really distressed in this world, and the numbers are high, and they don't have services. They don't have many places to go. It's very hard to be unhappy in a world where everybody's telling you this is very happy. It's very good.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about was something you were talking about with Sasha White in your podcast, Gender Wider Lens, and in an episode that was all about parents. And you talked about how, as a parent, when you're going into these gender clinics and these gender hospitals and these groups for parents or informational sessions, and they're telling you this is the right thing and everyone's going along, and they're telling you this is the only option really for your child if you want to be a good parent, if you don't want to traumatize them and irrevocably harm them, and that there's this kind of phenomenon of that trust of the white lab co and the authority. And it almost reminded me, the way you were describing it, of that social experiment or the behavioral experiment where they had They had people electrocute people or think they were electrocuting people very severely, even
Stanley
to the point of
Milgram.
death. Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah,
Because they were
yeah,
being told to by people in white lab coats. And that's
yeah.
so powerful for us as humans. Is very, very few people can actually seem to say no, which is scary.
It is scary. And I think one of the reasons why parents and people like me and you are so shocked and almost traumatized, well, traumatized, I would say, by the whole event is that we see it in reality. We see actually it's true. 70% of people will look the other way. And it's only when you see that and you realize, well, what does that mean? It means we've learned nothing. It means if there was a war and if fascists came into town, people would look the other way and say, I'm all right.
Mm.
And when you've seen that in your life, you can't unsee it. It's like you've seen the darkest side of humanity. You've seen the reality of those experiments. And you kind of, when we read and saw those experiments, it's shocking, but it's like, oh God, I hope we're more civilized now. And then you live through it and you think, oh my God, oh my God. And it's not just that the parents, and this is one of the things in the therapeutic support groups, it's not just that the parents are devastated and alone and think that their children are receiving the wrong care and treatment, but it's also they have seen people shrink away and not support when they know, when the people involved know that actually the kid needs better support. And just to be aware of that darker side of us on such an important point of their life, it's a horrible moment. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure you were through it.
Yeah, what you describe is, you kind of just gave me chills because that was so real and accurate and scary to see. And the other thing is that there are some parents who embrace it and then become lauded for it. I mean, you've mentioned in the past, like they'll write books about it, they'll start organizations, they'll make it their whole thing, their whole identity, not just their child's identity. And
Well,
then
it's
what
very
kind of pressure does that put on the other parents who see that?
well for starters, it's very exciting. Like I'm a parent, and it's very exciting to think you have a very special kid. We all think it, you know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? And we run around saying how special our kids are. And over time we realize, okay, maybe they're just ordinary,
Mm-hmm.
even though they're very special to me.
Of course.
But I think it goes to parents' heads, like this kind of suspicion that their kid is the most special kid in the world is borne out by the
Mm-hmm.
fact that they're transgender. So it goes to their head, it excites them, and they run with it. And there's a huge project then, because you can show your love in very tangible ways by supporting the child. And parents, in a way, us parents, all of us, we're running around trying to show our love in all sorts of ways to our children, and it's hard to be a parent, and it's hard to show your love. So if you had a tangible, these are the steps you take, this is what you do, and this is how you operate, it's very alluring for the parent who might feel a little bit inadequate, I would say, to say, yeah, okay, I'll do all of those, and then I will be the great parent. So that's one type of parent, if you follow me. And then the other parents are kind of browbeaten to go along with this, because if that parent thinks it's all fabulous and it should be so applauded, well, then we've got to get with the program. I mustn't love my kid enough if this parent thinks this is such a great thing, which doesn't stand up to critical scrutiny on any level. You know what I mean? Because the really brave thing to do with any kid is to look down the road and say, I know what I'm going to say isn't going to make you happy right now, but I do know it's the best thing for you, and so I'm going to do it. That's what the role of parents has been forever. It's not a very thankless role, but it's our role. That's our job. And yeah, the instant gratification of affirmation is a really dubious thing to sell to parents.
Mhm. Especially because the road leads to these surgeries. And that's what's hard for people who are completely on the outside to even wrap their brains around, that a parent would bring their child in for this surgery, which is medically unnecessary. And, whether it's mastectomy or later on, it would be the genital surgery, I suppose, unless the
Yeah.
parent decides to take their kid out to another country, right? Because
Yeah.
that can happen.
Well, I know parents, you know, who I've known over the years, and their kid was gender nonconforming like I was at 3 and 4 and 5, and they were told to transition the kid, and the parents went along with it, saying, "Okay, that's what I have to do," and change their identity so they go from he, him to she, her, and give her a new name, and now she's 6 and she's a girl, and things like that. And then they're rolling on with it, thinking this is the right thing. And then suddenly the doctor says, and now we're going into puberty blockers because puberty will be soon. And the parents are going, oh no, oh no, 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 no. I didn't think that was what was going to happen. I thought the kid was going to grow out of it.
Mm.
And they're like, well, actually, never before have we changed pronouns. Never before have we changed pronouns on 5-year-olds. The impact on these, like they're babies, they're 5. Telling a little girl that she could be a little boy and we're just going to call you little boy and one day we'll fix your genitals, they'll go, okay, great.
Yeah.
Mommy will do that. Yeah. And so then the mother starts, and I've worked with a few kids and parents. Not, I haven't worked with the kids, I've worked with the parents with this. And they've rode it back. They rode it back when they were faced with the puberty blockers and tried to come back the long road of actually, you know, when I said you could be a boy, you know, it was, you were trying it out and now we're going to try and go back. It's been very difficult and very hard. Most parents go with it because they've gone in so far. And so I don't think a lot of those parents who start at 5, they kind of think, oh, we'll see how it goes. This is what the kid likes. We're being child-centered. It's, you know, and we have this way as parents to say, oh, well, it's not like the way we were when we were kids. And it's like, well, for millennia, children have experimented in different roles. They've always done that. And this is the first generation that are saying, whatever the kid says goes. And that's a really heavy burden to put on a kid's shoulders, because kids should have the freedom to say crazy things and to have the parent to say no, no, and yes, depending on the context. You know, that's the parent's role, and that's the child's role is to do all that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a hard situation. I really think a lot of those affirming parents, I think they're really loving, really engaged, and they're being misguided by doctors and psychiatrists and psychologists. I don't have any dark, real feelings for the parents. I very much look at the medical profession and think, how can you sell this concept? It's 10 years old. What are you talking about? Do you know what I mean? We are in real experimental treatment pathways here.
And you mentioned that in your podcast that you think in the 30s, the 2030s, is when we'll start to see some of the impact of this trend.
Well, I think a few things about that in the future. I do think gender is here to stay, and gender dysphoria as a condition is here to stay. I think, you know, before, let's say, for example, before anorexia came in the 1970s, it was unheard of in the medical literature. It was 1 in, you know, a million. It was very few. Now, I'm not saying there weren't cases, but it wasn't common. And then it came into the cultural consciousness and it stayed. And it stayed as a concept of, when we talk about it, we in the mental health profession, when we talk about these, it's great to lift up. It's great to kind of reduce taboo. But when we reduce taboo and when we lift up these issues, more people suffer from them. Now that opens up so many difficulties, I don't even know where to go with it, but it's an actual fact. These culture-bound syndromes, they come out, they come in, and it's like they get in the water. Same with self-harming. Before self-harming became a thing, it was pretty unknown. And now it's really, really common. Same with bulimia, so many other issues. And you can actually, they've done studies, and there's some fascinating studies from Hong Kong and the island of Fiji and lots of different, Japan, lots of different studies have actually traced the arrival of, let's say, eating disorders into the culture. And it's really, really noticeable that once it comes in, it stays. So I think gender dysphoria is here to stay. I don't think it was ever in any big numbers, and now it's in. I don't see it leaving. And I know people don't want to hear that, but that's my own view. However, I do think we're going to expand our consciousness of gender and expand our consciousness of feminine boys wearing dresses, feminine men wearing dresses. Only today, a man said to me, I love to wear a dress. I was wearing a skirt today. I'd love to wear a skirt in this heat, he said. And I said, really? Still, even all these years in gender, and I'm still so narrow-minded to go, really, would you? You know what I mean? So we've a lot to go, but I think in the 2030s and stuff, I think there'll be a lot, I hope, there'll be a lot of room for men to be swishing by in their dresses and their mascara, and they're still going to be men. You know what I mean? So I do think I think all this conversation hopefully will bring about a wider consciousness of who we can be as men and as women. But I do think that the gender dysphoria as a condition is in. I don't see it leaving, sadly.
Yeah. I want to put another counter argument to you that I'm taking from Nathan J. Robinson, which now, as I say that, I'm wondering if he's the best the other side has to offer. But I'll put it to you to get your response, even though I don't think it's particularly convincing. But he was saying that there shouldn't be a focus on detransitioners. He made sure to be careful to say, not that we shouldn't ever cover it, but that there shouldn't be a focus on it because it's already so hard for trans people to get the care they need. This is, the words he used. There are so many barriers in place for them to get the care they need. He says that people mostly have to wait a long time for their treatments and for their gender medicine, and that's the real issue here.
Is he from the USA?
Yes.
And
although I think he was born in England.
If he went down to Planned Parenthood tomorrow, he'd get his hormones. So I'm not sure where he's getting his information from. I kind of think, I have been told the New York Times kind of, what's the word, excludes the word detransition from their style guide because it's considered harmful to the trans folk. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's detransphobia. And they'd want to watch themselves there because it's narrow-minded and bigoted. But I think it's very, very important that everybody gets a voice. If you want to give the best care for trans people, you need to listen to the detransitioners so that they get the best care. You can only learn from your mistakes. So it's so wrong-minded to say we suppress the mistakes because mistakes are scary. No. That's not how you deal with mistakes. You deal with mistakes by confronting mistakes and looking at them and seeing how we could have done better. That's number one. But the second point is, one of the reasons why people are waiting, and I think it's terrible that people are waiting, certainly in the UK and Ireland, people are waiting for a long, long time to see gender specialists. They're not waiting a long time in the US. That's why I asked that question. But they are waiting a huge amount of time in the US, in the UK and Ireland. And I think that's awful. And I think it's because so many people think only gender specialists can work with me when I've got gender issues. That's a fallacy. There's no legislated, recognized, accredited qualification. Do you follow me? Like I got a gender identity certificate so easily, you know what I mean? I went online, it was 200 quid, did it over the Christmas holidays, sent it in. It was supposed to be a 6-month course, but it was like, it didn't take me anything like 6 months because it was very, very simple. And this moniker of I'm a gender specialist, these are self-identified gender specialists. So people waiting for these gender specialists, they shouldn't. They should go to ordinary good therapists. Any good, competent therapist who's good at working with distress should be able to work with dysphoria. And there's nothing special about gender dysphoria. It's a distressing condition. And there's lots of ways to alleviate distressing conditions. And for some people, they might transition and might feel better. There's lots of ways into gender dysphoria and there's lots of ways out. And I think it's a disservice to people to presume that all they can do is transition. It's so narrow-minded. It makes my head rattle when I think people presume that. So that's my answer to Nathan.
Yeah, and to be fair to him, he was referencing the UK when he mentioned the wait times.
Yeah, they are awful. They're harrowing. They're awful, and it's causing a huge amount of distress. And I would say it's needless. If we could get more therapists just to work with these kids would be much better off, rather than thinking only the person who's done these random online courses or 3-day workshops or whatever the hell they've done to become their gender specialist.
Yeah. So, what is it like when a parent brings their child to one of these? Can you give us like an inside look? What would be the typical, let's say they have the kid who fits the profile of nerdy and shy, and then they go in and they get this diagnosis of dysphoria right away, or how does that work?
Well, it depends on where they go, but very often, if they're in the UK or Ireland, they'll have a huge wait time. So they're built up and they're built up and
Mm.
they're 3 years waiting, and they burst in the door and they get their diagnosis within three, sessions. So it's like, okay, it did take you 3 years, but you got no
Yeah.
therapy in those 3 years.
Yeah.
So
And will they
that's
have meanwhile changed their pronouns and gone through the social transition?
very often, not
Mm-hmm.
always, but some of them, it's quite noticeable. There's often a difference with the boys. Boys aren't bothering with the change of their pronouns or changing their name. They're just like, give me the drugs.
Hmm.
It's all a fake until I get the drugs. While the girls very often are very interested in the pronouns. And this is a sweeping generalization. It's not always the case, but it's got something I've noticed from parents. But very often they go into the clinic, the mother's delighted they finally got the appointment. Whether they're in the US or the UK, they're like, the professionals are in, great. Okay, finally now get the kid in, and serious support is going to happen. And then quite quickly, the specialist will say something along the lines of, okay, right, so you say you're a boy, we need you to medically transition as soon as possible, and we'll show you how to. And there's no kind of interest in looking at the motivation. There's no interest in maybe homophobia, internalized homophobia, or distress that has been kind of targeted and channeled into one solution. No, very little. It's all about, okay, so you think you're going to transition. Okay, how do we make that happen for you? Would you like me to call you your new name, and what are your pronouns? And so the kid is like, wow, that's so satisfying. So satisfying psychologically to come in and say, I think I have gender dysphoria. And I remember I was friends with this guy called Patrick, and he's from Germany. He did some brilliant YouTube videos and he got so much attention, he took them down. But he went in to his psychologist. He was distressed about his gender. And he went into his psychologist thinking the psychologist is an expert. He's a gender specialist. He'll tell me what's wrong with me. And within 45 minutes, the psychologist said to him, yeah, I can see you need to transition, and here's the prescription within 45 minutes of the first meeting, okay? And off Patrick went delighted. Oh, great, yeah. He saw that I had to transition. That's okay. I've got my solution. I thought it was really complex, but actually it's quite simple. Brilliant. Okay, what I need to do is now transition. And about 6 months later, Patrick was at a conference for trans people, and his doctor was speaking. And his doctor said, I affirm everybody who comes in. And Patrick's world shook. He was like, what? He didn't see my inner trans. He just affirms everybody. And he unraveled, and he had the darkest moments of his life, seriously, seriously awful times then. And he detransitioned in the end after a long road, all because he thought the doctor saw something special. And that's where I get really weirded out by these doctors who proclaim they can see the future, and this 5-year-old or this 8-year-old or this 13-year-old should transition. I'm like, you don't know. You cannot know. Look at your average 13-year-old and you cannot know what the adult they will be, because it's phenomenal how much we change.
Yeah.
And so I really feel this idea that they can look into their eyes and decide who should transition and who should not. I think it's a really hubristic, kind of terribly high-handed, godlike kind of position to take.
Hmm. That is truly nightmarish. Wow, yeah, that's a nightmare situation. Had Patrick gone through surgeries?
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
And so then he came on. He was really good. He came on YouTube and said, "I have things to say." And he did a series of YouTube videos which went electric. They were so big, so quickly. And then he got a huge amount of attention. He did an interview with Der Spiegel or something, the German newspaper. And then he closed it all down, closed the YouTube, closed everything, and went to live his life. I met him. I became friendly with him. Beautiful man. He did his piece for the world, if you follow me,
Mhm.
told his story, and then he moved on. And I love to see detransitioners who do that they kind of, they tell their story, they get it out, and then they move on. I know there was a detransitioner, Kale, who's in my film, Trans Kids, and she's moved on. She's moved on. Do you know what I mean? no longer talks about it. She's like, yeah, I had the hard times. I told my story and now I've moved on. It seems appropriate that it's a way of getting over it is to say something awful happened to me and it was at the hands of doctors and it was irresponsible of them. And I need to tell people out there it's happening. And now, after a certain amount of processing, maybe I'll move on from it because if I keep on retreading this, I'm talking for years, I can see how it could become really difficult, I think.
Yeah.
Now I'm talking out of hand there because we don't know, because detransitioning was never seen in the numbers the way it is now. So this is a new cohort yet again.
Hmm. Yeah, well, we can definitely hope that for them that they don't become consumed by it, and that they're able to sort of move on in some ways.
Very
So,
difficult path.
mhm. So I want to ask you, what do you want to make sure people know about Genspect before we wrap up?
I want people to know that we're trying to lift parents' voices and that really, in many ways, the phenomenon of the trans kid came as a result of stories in the press of people like, for example, Jazz Jennings. And, you know, she was the first, I think, was she? The first trans kid in something like 2006 who came out. And I know she came under another name and stuff like that. And, you know, those stories shaped the narrative. And now there's another powerful story to shape the narrative, which is parents, loving, engaged, liberal, progressive, educated parents who are saying, my kid is getting very inappropriate medical treatment and therapeutic care. And I'd like people to, if they think they can place parent stories in the media or on, podcasts such as yourself and things like that, to give us a hand and help us out because we need to get the parent stories out because when you hear them, you'll go, oh wow, there's a whole unsaid story going on. There's a whole side narrative that nobody's listened to, and it's a big one.
Mm. Yeah, well, thank you so much, Stella. It was wonderful to talk to you. You're fascinating. I hope I get to talk to you again. Maybe you'll
Yeah.
come back on sometime in a
Or
few
you come
months.
on to us. We'll
Oh, that would
swap.
be wonderful. Yeah, we should absolutely. Yeah, I would love that. It was fascinating to hear everything from you. I wish I could just keep asking you questions because it's so I do have that also morbid curiosity where I want to look under the rock because it's so disturbing, some of these things. But I'm glad that there are people like you working to bring this out and just with so much empathy and thoughtfulness. And
Yeah.
I don't see how people can listen and dismiss you as a bigot, but I think there's this scary cultural silence going on right now that I do think will change in the coming years. So,
I hope so. I
yeah.
hope so.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate
Thank
this.
you.